You're listening to KYRS, Medical Lake and Spokane, 88.1, 92.3 on your FM dial. It's 3 o'clock on Wednesdays, and that means this is Long Waves with Gary Krug. And I will tell you at the top of the show, as I always do, that the opinions expressed on Long Waves are solely my own and are not necessarily those of KYRS, its staff, management, or underwriters. And thank you for joining me on this snowy Spokane day. Winter's well upon us. I guess we're celebrating the solstice with style, huh? Maybe. Anyway, I wanted to pick up today on some of the themes I've been working with in the show of late. And particularly, let's get this mic right where I want it. There we go. Particularly, I would like to work with an uncooperative mic. Okay. There we go. I'd like to talk about the death of the future. I've been talking about for a couple of weeks now how when the social structure becomes unhinged, when the social structure comes undone from the world that people expect it to be, this has a series of interesting effects. And one of these we have to explore today is what I'm calling the death of the future. I've just got to do all kinds of arranging here in the studio today so I can make the squeaky chair quit and the mic stay where it's supposed to be. All right. So, where to begin with this? Well, maybe with a little look back into history. We've had this idea in the United States forever that the United States is a new beginning. It's a clean slate, a tabula rasa, on which we can write whatever we want to write. And that's how this country has lived. There was, always this lying behind it were these old world cynicisms, the old world antagonisms, the old world feudal structure, the aristocracy. There was all of that. But the great move in America was to wipe the slate clean and begin all over. Lewis Mumford, in his book, The Mega Machine of Power, The Pentagon of Power, Volume 2, Mumford points out a problem with this. Mumford writes that the attempt, quote, the attempt to make a new beginning rested on the valid perception that at various points something had gone profoundly wrong in man's development. Instead of accepting this as ineradicable as an integral defect for which the theological name had been original sin, and instead of submitting to it as fatally ordained by the gods, Western man, in his growing self-confidence, wanted to wipe the slate clean and begin all over. And therein lay a trap. For in order to overcome time, in order to begin anew, it was imperative for him not to run away from his past, but to confront it, and literally to live down its traumatic events within himself. Literally live down the traumatic events of our past within ourselves. Mumford continues, until every generation did this consciously, examining its hoary tradition in the light of new experience, evaluating and selecting every part of its heritage, man could make no fresh start. And one mind after another, that effort was begun. But at too early a point it was abandoned. So it remains an urgent task for our own day. Now, I've said on the show before, a real part of the national disease of our psyche is the absolute refusal to examine our past. And as we don't understand who we have been in the past as a people, we cannot understand who we are in the present as a people. And we cannot imagine something beyond the present as a people. If you notice, nobody has the great dreams and plans anymore. Maybe they're terribly young. I don't know. But those dreams of a government that serves people, of growth and prosperity in healthy ways, of creating a more just world, who thinks this way? Who speaks this way? Who acts in these manners? So, this speaks to a lack of imagination for what our future could be, to what it could have been had we taken some different paths. And perhaps there is yet something we can reclaim from it. But let's get back to Mumford for a minute. Quoting again, he says, "Looking back, we can now see that the proposal to wipe the slate clean and begin afresh in the New World was based on an illusion, or rather, a series of illusions. In the act of conquering the Americas and establishing trading posts and colonies elsewhere, from the Cape of Good Hope to Java, the invaders could maintain themselves only by drawing heavily upon the new technology with its guns, steel knives, machetes, and hardware of all kinds. The more prosperous the New World settlement, the less it had for its own primitive foundations, once dearly prized, later sentimentally over-celebrated." So this westward march, of the pioneer, the claiming of this naked land, lies in our past, but without us fully accepting the moral responsibility of genocide against the first peoples here, without accepting the absolute ruthlessness and brutality of Standish and all of those first people, Cotton Mather, all of those people who built America. Well, they didn't build it. They stole it. And they stole it by murdering. Now, here's a question for you. How does one get to murder? Let's put it that way. How does one get to murder? To murder being a good thing, to chopping off heads and putting them on stakes. We're used to seeing this from ISIS. We're used to seeing this from Islamist extremists. Yet the founders of this country engaged in exactly those kinds of behaviors. Ruthless murders of children, of women, chopping off heads, putting them on stakes. This is our history. And as I've said before, ISIS is in some ways our shadow. And they understand us very, very, very well. They understand how to make Americans afraid. They understand how to make Americans turn against one another. And every time they pull off one of these terrorist raids and the Americans react, and it's all fearful, and it's all, we got to get rid of the Muslims, and it's all, we got to keep the Muslims from coming into the country. ISIS wins. It accomplishes exactly what they set out to do. And the U.S. responds like a stupid oaf of a nation incapable of learning from its own past mistakes, and goes in and bombs and bombs and bombs. Now, at this point, we could remark that this U.S. strategy in its current form had a beginning, and it was in the People for the New American Century, Program for the New American Century, Dick Cheney's little think tank group in the 1990s, who published that book about America in the future, right? Their manifesto. And in the manifesto, they were saying things like, well, the U.S. will need to invade 7 countries in the Middle East in 5 years. And it's all there in black and white. And so they set to doing this, country after country after country. So Libya, Somalia, Iraq, Syria, all the countries that the U.S. was going to have to invade, wipe out the current government, and install a new, more modern government. And for the neocons, they called this extending the zone of freedom. So it all ended badly, though. It all ended terribly badly for everyone except ISIS, which the U.S. has directly or indirectly funded and sourced, and our dear NATO partners in Turkey have been major suppliers, the major suppliers of arms to ISIS, they and the Saudis. Golly gosh. So this group rises up with this absolutely ruthless behavior. But what's the difference between their ruthless violence and Dick Cheney and George W.'s ruthless violence, or Barack Obama's now ruthless violence? What's the difference exactly? Oh, we sit in underground rooms with TV sets flying remote control drones and kill people around the world. Nothing ruthless about that. It's technology. You don't even get your hands dirty. Oh, we fly planes overhead and drop bombs on people who have no air force and are utterly defenseless against our planes. No harm there. Oh, and we fund other ruthless, mercenary, bloodthirsty groups around the Middle East and around the globe to do our bidding, to act as proxy armies. But again, our hands are quite clean. But murder is murder is murder. So how did we get, I want to ask, how did we get to this point where no one's responsible for anything? No one in government is responsible for anything. I mean, think about it for a minute. Who goes to jail? Who even loses an election? Who suffers the public reprobation for violating decency? In The Violence of Organized Forgetting, most wonderful book, I strongly recommend it. It's by Henry Giraud. Giraud writes this: neoliberalism, the philosophy of the current world, and neocons are neoliberals wearing different polo shirts. Neoliberalism creates a political landscape devoid of public accountability, access, and agency, which is to say, devoid of democracy itself. As a predatory competition for hoarding profit, neoliberalism produces massive inequality in wealth and income, shifts political power to financial elites, destroys all vestiges of the social contract, which I've talked about on the show before, and increasingly views unproductive sectors, most often those marginalized by class, race, disability, resident status, and age, as suspicious, potentially criminal, and ultimately disposable. It thus criminalizes social problems and manufactures profit by commercializing surveillance, policing, and prisons. Does this not sound like our world? But here's the interesting bit. Instead of being outraged, instead of being horrified, instead of rising up in one voice and saying, no, this is not the America we dreamed of, that this is not the America worth fighting for. This is some kind of nightmare world we've been thrown into. Instead of doing that, people are sucked into it. People are sucked into supporting candidates who will destroy them, who will destroy their lives, who will strip Medicare, who will strip Social Security, who will strip food stamps. You know, just a few miles north of us here, Cathy McMorris Rodgers, right, always votes very conservative. And if you look at the counties, that area up there in the north part of the state, north of Spokane here, this frightening number of people is one of the highest levels of federal assistance in the country by county. Why do these people support programs that would hurt them? Because they buy the rhetoric of hate and fear and otherness. Because they no longer have a sense of the social fabric. It has been well and truly shredded. And yet, here's Cathy, Ms. McMorris Rodgers. Here's Donald Trump. Here's Ted Cruz. Here's all of these people and Fox News talking about the welfare queens and big government is bad and we've got to eliminate it. And when it is eliminated, these poor people who voted for it will be the most damaged by its loss because they don't actually get how the world works. They live in a fantasy world. They live in a world of ignorance and superstition and fear that prevents them from seeing the real world or seeing what the consequences of their own actions might be in this real world. Giraud continues that at the center of this neoliberal narrative, right, of spending money on war, of militarizing the police, of this massive surveillance project which surveils all of us 24/7, the destruction of unions, all of this. What underlies it is this thing he calls the disimagination machine that, quote, spews out stories inculcating a disdain for community, public lives, public values, and democracy itself. He continues, celebrated instead are pathological varieties of individualism, distorted notions of freedom, and a willingness to employ state violence to suppress dissent and abandon those suffering from the collection of social problems ranging from chronic impoverishment and joblessness to homelessness. Within this rationality, markets are not merely freed from progressive government regulation, they are removed from any considerations of social class. And is that not what we had up in Michigan? Is that not what we had up there in Flint? When the city started drawing water from the Flint River, and suddenly all the children start showing up with stupidly high lead levels. Oklahoma never used to have earthquakes. They have earthquakes all the time now from the fracking. Everybody knows it's from the fracking. Everybody knows. Is anybody going to be responsible for this? And some of the things that we change, some of the things that are destroyed in this mindless pursuit of power and wealth and this rationality of the markets cannot be replaced. Really, we're going to drill for oil in national parks? Seriously? Yosemite? Glacier? Seriously? But it'll all be fine because we do such a good job with oil drilling. We never have accidents. We never have leaks into rivers, do we? We don't have railroad cars fall off the tracks and explode, wiping out whole towns like in Lac Magnetique in Canada. We don't have it. What do we have? We have inflated rhetoric of the political right. I'm quoting Giraud now. We have market-driven media peddling spectacles of violence. This leads to a criminogenic and death-dealing forces undermining our collective security, and it justifies cutbacks to social securities and suppressing opportunities for democratic resistance. In other words, participating in government, that would be democratic resistance. Quote a little bit more from Giraud here. Saturating mainstream discourses with anti-public narratives. The neoliberal machinery of civic death effectively weakens public supports and prevents the emergence of much-needed new ways of thinking and speaking about politics in the 21st century. But we don't do a lot of that, no. We have disposable people who we want to go away. Well, there are 15 cities here in the season of joy and love and the birth of the Christian Savior. 15 cities which are destroying the homeless camps. Wasn't there something about no room at the inn in that Christmas story? And isn't there something in the Christian story about, serving the least among you? Yeah, there is. But lip service. Call yourself Christian. Talk the talk, but don't walk the walk. So even religion ends up redefined as something to fit the political realities of the present. If it's inexpedient to help the poor because they're disposable, well, it's their fault. And we can cherry pick some Bible verses to deal with that one too, and miss the larger truths contained within that. How else to explain the right-wing charge, quoting Giraud, that the poor, disabled, sick, and elderly are moochers and should fend for themselves? This is not simply an example of the kind of hardening of the culture. It's also part of the machinery of civil and social death that crushes any viable notion of common good, public life, and the shared bonds and commitments that are necessary for community and democracy. Well, obviously, what's needed here is for people of imagination, those few who still exist, to create alternative stories about what the future might be, to imagine a different kind of future. But that's extremely hard to do. That is extremely hard to do. What would such a future look like? And how do you talk to people about a future who really have no sense of the future? See, if whatever one knows is to be truth, if whatever one knows to be truth is based merely on their assertions, without substance in the world, without logic, without proof, then what in fact do they know? And what in fact can they build in the future if their present sense of true has no logic, proof, or substance? They can't project into the future. But on some level, I am quite convinced that people know that the future is dead to them. The future is dead to them. What do we have instead? Right, what is the promised future to look like? Well, let's see. You can be an uber rich, Martin Shkreli kind of guy or gal. You can be an apparatchik like Hillary Clinton. Where are our heroes? Part of the problem is that we've constructed a system, as I've said before, based on false models of rationality. False models of rationality. So we think there is a system, a way for doing things. I mean, think about those guys flying the drones down in the basements. They're even letting enlisted personnel fly drones now because the burnout is so high on drone pilots. How far removed are these people from the act of killing? Hugely. And yet they still find it hard to do day after day after day. Well, a good systems analyst would tell you what you need are people more like Adolf Eichmann, the obedient exterminator of the Hitler period, who had no trouble doing what the system told him to do. So, if we give people a little distance from the act of killing, if we give people a little distance from the act of dispossessing people of their homes, dispossessing people of their rights, if we give them a little distance from that, it's easier for them to do it. And distance comes from the ways that we cast people in our stories, in our narratives, in TV, the racism. This country's always been racist. It's always had these virulent hates. And sometimes it wasn't about race per se, but about religion or nationality. I think race is a made-up term anyway that doesn't have a lot of use. But people who have some marker of difference, we have such a long history of that. You know, the Know-Nothings protested, the Know-Nothings back in the 1800s, protested the Statue of Liberty being put up because the Pope had sent that wasn't the Statue of Liberty, it was the Washington Monument, excuse me, because the Pope had sent over a rock from a basilica in Europe somewhere to be included in it. And they were convinced this was part of some kind of hideous Catholic plot. But at various times we've hated Jews, Catholics, any split-off group of Protestants. You know, think about the inland Northwest alone and the West in general. Well, you know, the Chinese, the French, the Native Americans were all despised. Laws were passed against them. Japanese children were forbidden to go to schools in Washington into the 20th century, in the early part of the 20th century. But back to Eichmann. There is this rationality. And you think about the rationality that the Germans built. It was staggering. I mean, down to cooking people for soap, down to grinding their bones for fertilizer. And here's Eichmann doing his job. Lewis Mumford again observes, in every country, there are now countless Eichmanns in administrative offices, in business corporations, in universities, in laboratories, in the armed forces, orderly, obedient people, ready to carry out an officially sanctioned fantasy, however dehumanized and debased. So we give more and more power to these organizational systems. More and more power to these organizational systems. And the more power we give them, the fewer qualms they have for using the violence that we've put in their hands. Look at the militarization of the police. It is the rationality of the system. The rationality of the system. This is how you bring about systemic change at the same time you bring about change in people's lives and minds and hearts. It's not a hard thing to do when you get right down to it. The other has always been there for us, right? Chinese, Indians, French, Protestants, Catholics, whoever. The other has always been there for us. But the difference now is that we have these marvelous social and pedagogical and political and propaganda mechanisms to bring about this full indoctrination of people to one or two unified fears. Right? One or two hates that kill the real, that destroy the idea of the other. And once the idea of the other is destroyed, it's a small matter for most people to destroy the person. One unified fear, one unified hate that kills the real, that kills our own experience of the other, our own observations and memories, and places in their stead what? These dark fantasies substituting for reality. Dark fantasies substituting for reality. And if you're not working with a real view of the world, a view of the world that actually fits what the world is, what then is your future? If you're not building a future based on the real, what then is your future? If it's based on fantasy and hate and fear and anger, what then? Can one foresee a future that's not fantasy and hate and anger and destruction and horror? Is it even imaginable? Look how easily we've slipped into these eternal wars. How long has the U.S. been at war in the Middle East? How long? The last 4 presidents have all bombed Middle Eastern countries. And it's completely natural. Most people don't even know what's going on. Most people couldn't find Syria on a map. They couldn't tell you anything about the country, its people, its history. Same with Iraq. The same with Libya. I bet most people in this country don't even know that Saudi Arabia invaded Yemen with our support and blessing. And maybe the changing point was 9/11. Maybe. Maybe that's the moment the whole mechanism was rolled out like one big shiny new car with lots of lights and horns and whistles and, maybe a couple of raccoon tails on the radio aerial. I mean, something flashy, Something's going to reach out. But this marvelous, efficiency of civilization was supposed to gather us in to a place that was going to be filled with light and good and joy. And it's turned into a very, very dark, destructive dream. And increasingly, we are like the pilots of those drones, sitting in little basements, working our joysticks, and watching figurative electronic fantasies of death and sex and destruction play out in front of us. And like those drone operators, this also deadens us. But we think it's normal. We think it's normal. Mikhail Epstein calls this horrorism. Horrorism is the state of a civilization in fear of itself, because any of its achievements can become a weapon for its own destruction. Even white powder and nail files can be perceived as a potential threat. And he goes on to talk a little bit here. He says, remember after 9/11, the American people were advised, quote, by the U.S. government to lead their normal life, continue with their business, while at the same time being particularly vigilant and careful. That ambiguous recommendation was met with many sneers and complaints, because how is it possible to reconcile normal life with vigilance and pervasive danger? But these complaints are prompted by mindsets of previous times, the more relaxed and innocent, back when we could complain about things like this. The mature civilization of today, continues Epstein, enters a zone of extreme risk that increases with each new stage of progress. The formula for the future is this: business as usual plus the horrification of the entire way of life. The horrification of the entire way of life. So we're caught in a system of traps from which there is no escape. We had some chances to do something about it, but we've missed a lot of them. We've missed the chance to make peace with our own past, admit our faults, admit our sins and guilt, and see ourselves for who we are, not for who we want to be. Because only from starting with a position of reality, a position of genuine examination and thought, can one possibly build something real for a future? But we have so much trouble with this. We don't have a civilization. We have what Melville called a snivelization. And now as the country lurches toward becoming a banana republic run by oligarchs, while the powers of you and I are systematically being stripped. The rights of you and I are systematically being stripped. That whole parts of cities are being written off. That whole groups of people have become non-entities. Do we not see how this leads to violence? Sarah Lazar, on the 20th of this month, wrote a piece for Common Dreams. Off the charts, violence against Muslims is ravaging the U.S. She talks about a measurable nationwide rise in Islamophobic violence. I wouldn't even call it Islamophobic violence. I would call it an imaginary violence aimed at Islam. Because Islamophobia suggests there's some kind of psychological cure for it. Yeah, the cure for it is to quit thinking like asses. So, New York Times reported on a study from California State University that showed that instead of the average of 12.6 suspected hate crimes against Muslims for the past several years, instead since mid-November, there have been 38. So from 12.6 to 38. That's a lot. And we see arson and vandalism of mosques and shootings and death threats. I mean, a fellow shot a guy in the face for saying, you know, I used to kill people like you in Iraq, while he was robbing them, of course. And that's the interesting thing about racism, is you can use it to justify absolutely anything. You're unhappy with your marriage, take it out on the brown person. You're unhappy with your job, it's the brown person's fault. You don't have a job, ooh, it's all the brown people's fault. You see how this works? You see how this works. So the Council on American Islamic Relations said that there were 29 documented attacks in 2015. It's the highest annual number that they've recorded since they began keeping track in 2009. November 2015 was the most significant spike, with a total of 17 mosque attacks, and all but 2 of those incidents occurring in the wake of the November 13th Paris attacks. What is the rationality of people who watch TV, hear about attacks 6,000 miles away, and freak out at home, who yet have no knowledge of the daily attacks conducted by their own government on people for no good reason whatsoever, and the wholesale destruction of countries, of entire subcontinents? Why stop with countries? Why stop? So anyway, a spokesperson for the CARE group, noted that this was not happening in a vacuum, and said, quote, "We are seeing an unbelievably toxic anti-Muslim environment in our society that is being encouraged and exploited by public figures like Donald Trump, Ben Carson, Rick Santorum, and others. This is leading to fresh incidents of hate crimes nationwide." I mean, you heard about Virginia, right? Down in Augusta County. They closed all the schools in the county for a day after a class in world geography taught a lesson on Arab calligraphy, Arab writing. And of course, it wasn't about the Muslims they were worried about, it was the racist backlash they were worried about. Racist backlash. So, when we see these rallies, these staged vigils and speak-outs, we see all of this. And is this not who we've always been? I mean, seriously. Is this not who we've always been? Racist, violent, vicious, avaricious, destructive, genocidal. And as I've said before, until we recognize ourselves and explore those dark parts of our past and those dark parts of our minds and those very, very dark parts of our culture, we will not get over it. We will not. And we look at the system that runs our world. Systems, but it's, a wheel and a wheel. Like the old gospel song, Ezekiel saw the wheel. Wheels and wheels, the wheels of the oligarchs, the wheels of finance, the wheels of industry turn the wheels of government. Here we had Tony Blair just recently, who apologized, for the fact that during the operation to remove Saddam Hussein, to overthrow him in 2003, he had some bad information, and he's sorry about that. And he's sorry that, well, gee, this might have led to the rise of ISIS, that whole invasion of Iraq, which most scholars agree did. So you remember what we did? We threw out Saddam Hussein without any proof. We accused him of being linked to terrorists. We called him out as a ruthless dictator, and then there was always those weapons of mass destruction he was going to get and have and already had and was going to use them on us, and lie after lie after lie. And everybody in the government knew this was a lie. This was all fabricated. And Blair's sorry that it all ended up very, very badly. Gee, Tony. It all ended up very badly. So, who is running this show? Who is running this show? There's an interesting piece recently released by one of my favorite writers of all things contemporary, Seymour Hersh. This was in the London Review of Books. What it pointed out was that for some time between 2012 and 2004, members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff were, well, first of all, they sent a, quote, constant stream of warnings to the civilian leadership about the dire consequences of toppling Assad. So we remove Assad from Syria, and they're saying, look, it's going to be Libya all over again. Absolute chaos, hell, pandemonium, and just crazy little groups. And this idea that there was somehow an opposition there who would step up and be worthy of succession to Assad was just a nonsense. All right? Lieutenant General Michael Flynn said the jihadists were in control of the opposition. And they were saying back then that Turkey wasn't doing enough to stop the smuggling of foreign fighters. General Flynn said, quote, we understood ISIS's long-term strategy and its campaign plans. And we also discussed the fact that Turkey was looking the other way when it came to the growth of the Islamic State inside Syria. So what did they get? Enormous pushback, quote, end quote. Enormous pushback from the Obama administration, quote, I felt they did not want to hear the truth. Our policy of arming the opposition to Assad was unsuccessful in actually having a negative impact. That's the Joint Chiefs telling the president this and telling the civilian leadership this. And because it was ideologically bothersome to the neocons and the neoliberals who are running these wars. Remember what I said about Dick Cheney's People for the New American Century, the Plan for the New American Century. Because of that ideology, the truth from your own military presented to you plainly is blown off, and you continue to run things through the CIA. Oh my goodness, what could go wrong? Well, we learned what could go wrong, right? That whole thing where we spent $500 million, and we ended up with 4 or 5 guys who were still allegedly battling the Islamic State. Do you remember when that 70 or so of them defected to Jabhat al-Nusra? As soon as they crossed the border into Syria after all this training and with their new gear and everything. The Free Syrian Army, who are our good friends who we think are going to, support all of our efforts. They are among the primary suppliers of weaponry to ISIS, right, according to this work, according to Hirsch's article. Right? The primary supporters. So, the really spooky part of this whole article, and I strongly encourage you to read it, you can find it online at the London Review of Books, Military to Military is the title. The really scary thing is that the military back-channeled information, the Joint Chiefs of Staff back-channeled information through Israel, through Russia, and through a European country, back-channeled information to Assad on where the terrorists were, what they were up to. In other words, fed them intel that they needed to have a fight. But they also were in direct contradiction of their commander-in-chief, the President of the United States. Funny how nobody mentioned that, except for Hirsch. Because on one level, that's tantamount to treason. But they did it outside of official channels, and eventually they stepped down or moved sideways. But think of this enormous split where the military and the CIA actually have very different ideas about how things should work. And the president, of course, sides with the CIA and the neo-libs and the neocons and this intense fantasy. This intense fantasy of death and destruction that produced this bizarre idea of an American planet controlled by oligarchs. Doesn't that sound wonderful? An entire planet run by the U.S. military, government enforced by the U.S. military, no individual freedom, no democracy, no institutions that would support and maintain democracy, no civil society whatsoever. And at any time you can be, written off. You just have no value anymore. This is the dream. This is why we're invading the Middle East. This is why we invaded all of those countries in South America. This is the future they project, but it is a future without humans. It is a future without citizens. It is a future without democracy. It is black. It is dark. And it is absolutely soul-shredding. This is the future toward which we move. And the way that we imagine the future has a great deal to do with how things come out. And if we're imagining nothing, or if our imagination is only of an immediate hate or anger directed at others, then we have no imagination. We have only fear. We have only hearts filled with dread. And there is no future. I, for one, refuse to accept that there is no future. And as Henri Giraud wrote, it is imperative for people who yet have imagination to be able to deploy that imagination as teachers, as artists, as citizens, in every way that they can, in every place that they exist, in their lives and in the lives of other people And finally, they need to project this into the future. We need to project this into the future. Educators, quoting Giraud, educators, artists, intellectual workers, young people, and other concerned citizens also need to create alternative narratives about what the promise of democracy might be for our communities and ourselves. This demands a break from established political parties, the creation of an alternative public sphere in which to produce democratic narratives and visions, and a notion of politics that is educative, one that takes seriously how people interpret and mediate the world, how they see themselves in relation to others, and what it might mean to imagine otherwise in order to act otherwise. And that concludes today's show. I'd like to thank you for listening to me today. Boy, this went by in a hurry. That happens sometimes. Before I get out of here, let me remind you that if you have a car or truck or boat lying around of no use to you or marginal use or even negative use, we'll take it. If you call 855-597-7227, we'll arrange a free pickup. You get the junker off your hands, you get a nice tax deduction, and KYRS gets some coins to rub together to keep this station on the air. So please, if you've got one of these lying around and just don't know what to do, this is a good time to do it. 855-597-7227. Car, truck, boat, we'll get rid of it. Well, thank you for listening today. You can email me on longwaves@kyrs.org. Find me on Facebook, Longwaves Radio, and on YouTube, Longwaves Radio. Put it in quotes. You'll turn it right over. Thanks again for listening. I'll be back next week. And again, to remind you, you are listening to KYRS Medical Lake, Spokane, 88.1 and 92.3 FM. Have a great holiday and a good weekend. I'll be back soon. Bye now.